It might be helpful, simply for the purpose of argument, to contrast here the theories of Freud with those of Darwin. Both had hypotheses that have proved enormously influential on subsequent thought. Neither of their hypotheses can be straightforwardly falsified, but for different reasons. Freud has provided us with a body of concepts and a manner in which they are related that is not falsifiable at all, because no empirical observations could distinguish between his theory and any competing theory. The status of his work, then, is like that of a philosophy, in that it provides a more or less convincing account of experience, and does not depend on scientific data one way or the other to carry that conviction. You take it or leave it depending on whether it makes better sense of your experience than any competing model, which doesn't mean that it is not valuable. We may find that it reconfigures our knowledge in a way that is richer than the one to which we are accustomed, and leads to the explanation of otherwise puzzling observations. Darwin, by contrast, has provided us with a hypothesis that relates intimately to observations, in relation to which empirical data are indeed relevant, notwithstanding the fact that no single experiment can possibly prove or disprove his hypothesis. To quote the Darwinian George Gaylord Simpson again, quote, "The most striking example of a theory that cannot be definitively proved or disproved is the most important of all biological theories, that of organic evolution. Although some quite limited predictions can be deduced from the theory was not in fact established by prediction and is not sufficiently tested by it, but an enormous number of observations, enormously varied in kind, are all consistent with this theory, and many of them are consistent with no other theory that has been proposed. We therefore can, and if we are rational, must have an extremely high degree of confidence in the scientific theory." Of course, I make no claim to be a Freud or a Darwin, but I do see clearly that my hypothesis is in this respect more like Darwin's than that of Freud's. It certainly can act as a philosophical model that reconfigures our knowledge in a way that I believe is richer, but it is derived from and can be tested against empirical experimental observations. The hypothesis could be seen as an aggregate of more local hypotheses, each of which can be tested against empirical evidence, and which can each be abandoned if they do not stand up to the findings. Enough with negative findings would invalidate the overall hypothesis, at least in its current form. Alternatively, it might turn out that at least some observations, enormously varied in kind, are consistent with this theory, and may be the case that many of them are consistent with no other theory that has been proposed. At least that is my belief. What might be examples of such observations in the case of the theory explained in this book? Let's start from some really basic questions about the brain that, fundamental as they are, have not, to my knowledge, been satisfactorily addressed by any other theory. Why is the brain an organ that exists only to make connections divided? Why is it asymmetrical in so many measurable respects, both structural and functional? And why does its functioning seem to depend on its being asymmetrical? And why is the major connection between the two cerebral hemispheres, the corpus callosum, getting proportionately smaller and functionally more inhibitory rather than larger and functionally more facilitatory with evolution? These indisputable observations are not addressed as satisfactorily by any alternative theories of which I am aware, but far more important than any of these, important as they are nonetheless, is that there is no alternative theory that makes sense as a whole of a large number of established hemisphere differences. We have no overarching theory that covers so many of the facts. They are otherwise simply treated as a random assortment of findings, inviting a shrug when the questions why such individual differences exist and how they make sense together are asked. But to me, for a scientist not to ask precisely these questions betrays an astonishing lack of intellectual curiosity, to say the least. The explanatory power of the hemisphere hypothesis is greater than any alternative that I know of, and as for the difference deniers, they can't even get to the first base. When a better theory is developed that covers as many findings, I will be the first to welcome that. That is how understanding evolves. I take comfort from the words of Max Planck. Quote, New scientific ideas never spring from a communal body, however organized, but rather from the head of an individually inspired researcher who struggles with his problems in lonely thought and unites all his thought on one single point, which is his whole world for the moment." End quote. I caused some confusion by remarking at the end of the book that while I thought it unlikely I would be shown to be wholly wrong, it would be remarkable if I were shown to be right in every respect. I followed that commonplace observation with words to the effect that in the worst possible case, the hemisphere distinction at least provided a valuable metaphor being how we come to understand the world. That has led some literal-minded people to assume that I do not believe in my own thesis, and that I think the decades spent investigating the neuroscience were irrelevant. It will hardly surprise you to learn that I am not of that view at all. I have, though, sometimes been asked how essential brain science is to a critique of the modern world picture, which is valid in its own terms. There are a number of answers to that point. First, in place of a list of unconnected observations about a culture or society, and a series of problems requiring a comparable list of unconnected solutions, the recognition of hemispheric differences provides for the first time a way of seeing the picture as a coherent whole. It shows the problem as necessarily interconnected consequences of espousing a certain take on the world. Incidentally, if I am right that we are currently enthralled to the left hemisphere's view, one of the consequences would be precisely an inability to see the whole rather than a heap of disparate elements, together with the relative inability to understand what is happening, rather than simply document it, and attempt as best one can to find a series of ad hoc solutions. Second, and following from this, it suggests that the best way to address such shortcomings as we identify will not be so much by piecemeal strategies necessarily as they are bound to become at some level, as by opening our eyes to the limitations of the view of the world which underlies them, the view which, as a society, we appear to adopt as our default. It is the aim of this book to do precisely that. We do not need more quick fixes. We need a shift in the paradigm. Third, by showing that the left hemisphere, which underwrites the fragmented vision, is both literally more limited in what it can see and less capable of understanding what it does see than the right, and to cap it all, is less aware of its own limitations. The book gives the reader good reason to reappraise the left hemisphere's worldview, wherever it can be identified as such. But there exists a fourth most important consideration. The book is not just a societal critique, but aims to achieve more, to add to an understanding of brain function, and to add thereby to our understanding of our own minds, to give us a means of evaluating ways of thinking that, although apparently equally rational, may sometimes be in conflict. It aims to help us better understand one aspect of what it is to be a human being, not, I repeat, in offering a causative mechanism as such, but in offering a descriptive, phenomenological model anchored in the science of the brain. Understanding hemisphere difference offers a perspective on the structure of mind which is not available merely by introspection. If in everyday life we were aware of the discrepancies in the view or take on the world each hemisphere offers, it would render the immediate business of survival impractical. For this reason, nature has taken care of these discrepancies, and taken care that these discrepancies should not be part of our everyday awareness. Even on sustained introspection, we can be only indirectly aware of the fact that reality is constructed from two incompatible world views. This fact becomes manifest, however, in the disputes of philosophers and theologians over the ages about the very nature of reality. But by such indirect routes, we become aware of fundamental irreconcilables in the world. Irreconcilables so marked that they have led philosophers time and again to conclude that we are citizens of two worlds, though those worlds were never fully articulated. The last 50 years have brought the means to carry out painstaking observations of brain function and the changes in the lived world of the individual whose function is altered. With that comes the knowledge that those two worlds the philosophers intuited are each underwritten by one hemisphere of the brain. Finally, it would appear to be a literal truth that as a society we are becoming more like individuals with right hemisphere deficits. There is evidence from the teaching profession which suggests that between a quarter and a third of children aged as old as 5 to 7 are now having to be taught how to read the human face, something that until recently would have been necessary only in the case of children with autism. And about a third of all children now have difficulty carrying out tasks that a decade ago virtually every child in a mainstream school would have been able to do easily, tasks that depend on sustained attention. Add to that research suggesting that young people today are less empathetic than children 30 to 40 years ago. If a neuropsychologist had to choose 3 things to characterize most clearly the functional contribution of the right hemisphere, they would most probably be the capacity to read the human face, the capacity to sustain vigilant attention, and the capacity to empathize. I am sometimes asked why, if the left hemisphere take on the world is less insightful, it has come to dominate the way we think. And if this has happened not just once, but 3 times, as I believe, in Western history at least, how do I account for that fact? These are good questions. I think there are, again, several reasons why this characteristic entrenchment occurs, and indeed is likely to occur whenever a civilization passes its peak. All of them, to some degree, illustrate the self-reinforcing, recursive nature of the left hemisphere's world, a world subject to positive feedback. First, the left hemisphere view is designed to aid you in grabbing stuff. Its purpose is utility, and its evolutionary adaptation lies in the service of grasping and amassing things. As such, it is seductive. It is probably for this reason that Eastern cultures, for example, which used to be more balanced in their outlook, are now adopting the current Western model of the world with such enthusiasm and appear set, very sadly, on outdoing the West at its own pernicious game. It is my view that we should be learning from them, not they from us. In the case of the Greeks, the Romans, and the post-Enlightenment West, the decline of civilization has been associated not just with more left hemisphere ways of thinking, but appropriately with forms of military or economic imperialism and a consequent overextension of administration, a coarsening of values, and a failure of vitality, vision, and integrity. Second, the left hemisphere view offers simple answers. Its mode of thinking prizes consistency above all, and claims to offer the same mechanistic models to explain everything that exists. This thinking is common to those who espouse naive reductionist science or scientism, enthusiasts for technological solutions to water complex human problems, and designers and implementers of bureaucratic systems. When this sort of thinking encounters a problem in reconciling apparent irreconcilables, for example, matter and consciousness, it simply denies that one element or the other exists. That is very convenient. Third, the left hemisphere's world and its worldview is easier to articulate. The left hemisphere is the speaking hemisphere. The right hemisphere has literally no voice. The attempt to make the implicit explicit radically alters its nature. As a result, finding the language to put across the way of being of the right hemisphere is simply harder than doing so for the naturally explicit left hemisphere. The left hemisphere relies on concatenations of serial propositions and the literal aspects of language to make meaning explicit. By contrast, metaphor and narrative are often required in order to convey the implicit meanings available to the right hemisphere, and in a left hemisphere-dominated culture, metaphors and narratives are disregarded as myths and fables, or at worst, downright lies. We live in an era where articulating and making explicit are of increasing importance and are treated as a mark of truth, and their inverse treated with increasing suspicion. Partly, this is another sign of the move to the left hemisphere that I am describing. But that is not the only reason for it. It is also necessitated by large-scale movements of populations with different languages and cultures, as well as the sheer size of modern urban societies in which one can no longer rely on much of what was once taken for granted in smaller and more closely knit communities. The implicit has now to be made explicit. The catch is that in becoming explicit, it is no longer the same thing at all. Fourth, since the Industrial Revolution, but particularly in the last 50 years, we have created a world around us which, in contrast to the natural world, reflects the left hemisphere's priorities and its vision. Today, all the available sources of intuitive life, the natural world, cultural tradition, the body, religion, and art, have been so conceptualized, devitalized, and deconstructed or ironized by self-consciousness, explicitness, and the systems and theories used to analyze them, that their powers to help us see intuitively beyond the hermetic world that the left hemisphere has set up has been largely drained from them. For many, television screens and computers supplant direct face-to-face experience of reality. The cerebral and the abstract, for example, management and its systems, have become more highly valued than the hands-on task that management exists to serve, with the odd effect that the higher you rise in your craft, skill, or profession, the more you will be removed from its performance in order to manage it. A century ago, the physical environment was for most of humanity that of the natural world, with its rhythms and cycles, its organic, ever-growing, and ever-changing interdependent life, a world to which it seemed intuitively obvious that we belong. Now it has been replaced for many by an unyielding, inert, confrontational environment of non-living surfaces. Straight lines, concrete masses, and largely generic shapes which are widely experienced as alienating. The result is that the left hemisphere's world has become externalized, so that when the counterbalancing tendency of the right hemisphere to check with the real world of experience is brought into play, it is already subverted. The world out there is already colonized by the left hemisphere's vision. There is a self-reflective hall of mirrors at work, where logic seems to lead back to a solution within the system itself, rather than a need to break out of it. Fifth, built into the relationship between the hemispheres is that they have a different take on everything, including on their own relationship. Neurological research reveals a consistent picture of how the two hemispheres contribute to the richness of experience. Essentially, this is that of the right hemisphere tends to ground experience. The left hemisphere then works on it to clarify, unpack, and generally render the implicit explicit, and the right hemisphere finally reintegrates what the left hemisphere has produced with its own understanding, the explicit once more receding to produce a new, now enriched whole. Note that the two ways of attending are both necessary and, strictly speaking, incompatible, at least at the same level and at the same time. This could be thought of as similar to the way a performer learns a piece of music. First, he or she is attracted to the piece as a whole and has a sense of how it works overall. Then the piece is taken apart bit by bit, its harmonic structure analyzed, certain passages of notes practiced repeatedly, and so on and so forth. But finally, all that must be banished from the performer's mind, if the performance is not to be hobbled and stilted. This is not to deny the importance of the left hemisphere's contribution, just to make clear that it works its necessary effects at an intermediate stage. Problems arise when this is treated as the end stage. In terms of the metaphor of the master and his emissary, the master realizes the need for an emissary to do certain work on his behalf, which he, the master, must not involve himself with, and report back to him. That is why he appoints the emissary in the first place. The emissary, however, knowing less than the master, thinks he knows everything and considers himself the real master, thus failing to carry out his duty to report back. The right hemisphere's view is inclusive, both, and synthetic, integrative. It realizes the need for both. The left hemisphere's view is exclusive, either or, analytic and fragmentary, but crucially unaware of what it is missing. It therefore thinks it can go it alone. Sixth, a culture that exemplifies the qualities of the left hemisphere's world attracts to itself, in positions of influence and authority, those whose neutral outlook is similar. People with certain autistic traits, for example, will be attracted to and be deemed especially suitable for employment in the areas of science, technology, and administration, which have, during the last 100 years, been immensely influential in shaping the world that we live in, and are, if anything, even more important today. Thus, a culture which already has some prominent autistic characteristics attracts to positions of influence individuals who will help it even further down the same path. This is not the only vicious circle involved. Increasing technologicalization and bureaucratization of life help to erode the more integrative modes of attention to people and things which might help us resist the advances of technology and bureaucracy, so that in this way they aid their own replication. They make us more like themselves. Finally, though the takes of the two hemispheres are made to work together below the level of conscious awareness, they are not strictly incompatible. This is most obvious when, as in our society, our thinking is no longer embodied in the practices, traditions, and rituals of a community, but is devoted in explicit, public, often political debate, where much of its subtlety and tolerance of necessary ambiguity gets lost. Once dragged into the light of day and scrutinized, the hemisphere takes are seen often to pull in opposite directions. The catch is that in such a society as ours, any apparent inconsistency is treated as a sign of error or intellectual muddle. Ambiguity is no longer a strength, given that truth is known to be complicated and many-layered. It is a weakness, since truth is thought of as a single and straightforward thing. It is therefore easier to accept the left hemisphere's point of view, which is easily articulated and unambiguous, and simply stands in contradiction to the right hemisphere's view, than to accept that of the right hemisphere, which is more multifaceted and harder to articulate, and is already inclusive of the apparently incompatible left hemisphere's point of view. This virtue makes it immediately vulnerable to the charge of inconsistency, and it is therefore dismissed. Since writing this book, I have begun to think more than ever before about the philosophical implications for how we see ourselves, the planet, and our relation to it. In this, I have been immensely helped by the reactions of readers and discussions with colleagues. It seems to me that we face very grave crises indeed, and that if we are to survive, we need not just a few new measures, but a complete change of heart and mind. I know from the moving correspondence I receive that this book has helped individuals, far more than I could have hoped or expected, to change their outlook on the world and even to change their lives in important respects, to do better at work, to save their marriages, to re-evaluate their goals in life. That has been a revelation to me, since I did not foresee the potential for it to have the direct therapeutic effect it apparently has. Societal change, however, is another matter. It would be good to hope that in some way the thesis of this book could play a small part in such a shift, but no one solution can be found to what are agreed to be complex, perhaps intractable problems. However, in an era where truth seems to be up for grabs, the question of what we can rely on as true seems ever more pressing. In particular, I believe that reductionism has become a disease, a viewpoint lacking both intellectual sophistication and emotional depth, which is blighting our ability to understand what is happening and what we need to do about it. My current thoughts are directed towards illuminating what I see as a truer picture, a more helpful and, I believe, a more hopeful way of seeing our situation here on this planet, while we still have time. This is the theme of my current thinking and writing. There are, it seems to me, four main pathways to the truth: science, reason, intuition, and imagination. I also believe strongly that any worldview that tries to get by without paying due respect to all four of these, science, reason, intuition, and imagination, is bound to fail. Each on its own has its virtues and its vices, its gifts and its inherent dangers. Only by respecting each and all together can we learn to act wisely, and each is a blend of elements contributed by either hemisphere. However, the same proviso applies in each case, namely that for each to be successful, science, reason, intuition, and imagination, what the left hemisphere can offer must be used in service of what the right hemisphere knows and sees, not the other way around. This is an important aspect in the case of science as in that of imagination, in the case of reason as in that of intuition. The left hemisphere is a wonderful servant, but a very poor master. We also need to be aware of the sheer extent to which the left hemisphere is, in the most down-to-earth, empirically verifiable way, less reliable than the right in matters of intention, perception, judgment, emotional understanding, and indeed intelligence as it is conventionally understood. And that means that we should be appropriately skeptical of the left hemisphere's vision of a mechanistic world, an atomistic society, a world in which competition is more important than collaboration, a world in which nature is a heap of resource there for our exploitation, in which only humans count, and yet humans are only machines, not even very good ones at that, a world curiously stripped of depth, color, and value. This is not the intelligent, if hard-nosed view that its espousers comfort themselves by making it out to be, just a sterile fantasy, the product of a lack of imagination, which makes it easier for us to manipulate what we no longer understand. But it is a fantasy that displaces and renders inaccessible the vibrant, living, profoundly creative world that it was our fortune to inherit, until we squandered our inheritance. Time is running out, and the way we think, which got us into this mess, will not be enough to get us out of it. Please read and I hope enjoy this book, and if its message should speak to you, take it forward into the world. We need, I believe, to see the world with new eyes, for as Henry Thoreau put it, quote, "The question is not what you look at, but what you see," end quote. That is the end, the second part of the preface to The Master and the Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World by Ian McGilchrist. A profound examination on the human mind, both from a psychological standpoint and a historical standpoint. The next two parts will be the introduction. We'll go through the first part of the introduction, and then we'll go through the second part of the introduction. And I've already read the book. The entire book, minus the notes, is about 460 pages long. Now, I've read the entire thing, and I highly recommend it. But next, we're going to go over the introduction of the Master and his emissary, talking about hemispheric differences and the relationship between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain that is separated by the corpus callosum.